pray these ancient and sacred words might be made new for us here today. Amen. Amen. So, a number of years ago, my wife and I graduated graduate school, got married, honeymooned, flew back to Georgia where we were living, packed up our things and moved to Idaho where we began our married life together, began our life in ministry together. And it was at this lovely little church in the middle of nowhere, Idaho. Somehow this couple from Scotland had landed, and there was a gentleman by the name of Jim McGonigal, just a fun name to say. And he had a lovely accent, and he was often liturgist, and the congregation took a vote, and they made him permanent liturgist because everyone enjoyed his voice so much. And Jack, you are in danger of the same thing. So once you're gone, we might have a vote. Not gone for good, but just gone out of the room. So, but thank you for that. Thank you. So there was a famous experiment that happened in the 80s. It's called the gorilla experiment, where people were shown a video of a group of people. It was 6 people, and half of them were wearing black clothes and half of them were wearing white clothes. And the people dressed in black shirts had a basketball. And the people watching the video were asked to count the number of times the people in black shirts passed the basketball to each other. And the people in the white shirt kind of just danced around, and they were all in this circle. And so the people, who were taking part in this experiment watched the video really closely. And, they're like 1, 2, 3. And so they got to like 6 or 7 or 8. And then they turned off the video and they said, well, what else did you notice? And somebody has heard of this before. I hear the chuckle. And, and the participants in the experiment were like, well, we noticed that the people in white were doing this. I think I noticed one of the people had a beard. And then the interviewer, the experimenter, said, did you happen to notice the person in the gorilla costume that danced through the video? And almost every participant said, what? And so they showed him the video again, and this time they said, don't worry about the basketball, just watch the video. And sure enough, in the middle of this group of 6 people, 3 of whom are passing a basketball back and forth, a person in a gorilla suit came out and did a dance and then moved on. And the percentage of people who didn't notice the dancing gorilla was something remarkable, like 89% of the people who took part in this experiment. And I think it's fascinating because we're sitting here today saying, well, of course I would have seen the dancing gorilla. But we miss the obvious. We do. As human beings, we look, but we don't see. And often we listen, but we don't hear. I mean, think of how many times you're in a conversation with somebody and you're listening to them and then your mind goes somewhere else. And maybe you're thinking of what you're going to say when you get a chance to speak. Or you start thinking about your car, your to-do list, your dog, something. And then all of a sudden you tune back in. You snap back in. And you're just like, oh man, I just missed a lot of what they're saying. And they're looking at you expecting a response. And you're like, I kind of think we live in a time where we struggle to find God. I think there's kind of a pandemic of despair and hopelessness. And I think it's because we often are struggling to see God and to hear from God. And so we often live like God is absent from our lives and from our churches. And it's been interesting over the 20-some years that I've been a clergy person, I've been a pastor in parish ministry, because I often hear questions like this, especially when it comes to problem solving, when we talk about the life of the church and the life of the congregation, I often hear questions like this. Well, what should we do? What can we do to grow the church? How do we fix this problem or situation or this issue? And there's all these questions. And I've noticed over the years that more often than not, and this is not just in this church or the other church that I'm serving right now over at First UMC of Bellevue, this is in nearly every church, probably every church that I've ever served or that I've worked with in special capacities. That the questions are almost always like, what should we do? What can we do? And that's fine. I like that they're asking questions, but there's something missing from that question. What is it? How about a question like this instead? Where is God in this situation? As we work to understand what we should do, what would God have us do? Or a question like, what is God trying to get us to learn right now? How is God trying to heal us or save us right now? It's amazing how often in congregations I sit down with people and I don't hear those questions. And I think it's not a failure of faith. I don't. But I think what is happening is that we live in a way, and we live in a time and a place where we struggle to find God. And we struggle in a way that I'm not sure our parents or grandparents or ancestors did, because we live in an age where our attention, where our eyes and ears and minds and hearts are simply assaulted with things clamoring for its attention. There's phones and screens and all sorts of things and programs that are designed to addict us to outrage. There are whole channels devoted to making us afraid and angry and then getting us to kind of stay angry like an addict. And if we go for a stretch of time without it, we get upset. And I think it's because we get overwhelmed with the flash and the sparkle and the noise. It's everywhere. And so I've often wondered by Jesus' use of parables. And I've often wondered, why did he obscure what he was trying to say? Think how maddening that must have been for the people around him, the disciples especially, but the other followers, where they're trying to understand. We get the sense that the disciples, one of my former clergy friends used to call them the disciples, because they seem so obtuse at times, but I don't think that was the case. I think that they genuinely were trying to understand. But Jesus made people work for it. They would say, something like, what about this teaching? And rather than saying, oh, that teaching needs to be updated, he would say, let me tell you a story about a horse and a hole and a person. And they'd be like, can you just tell us what we need to know? So why did he make people work for it? Why did he spend most of his time, when it came to teachings, why did he use parables? When everyone around him, I think, just wanted him to speak plainly. I've come to believe that the point of the parables, at least some of them, wasn't the teaching of the parable, but also to see how well the followers of Jesus can see and hear. Because just after this passage that Jack so charmingly read for us, the disciples actually asked him this very question. They said, why? And you can insert whatever tone of voice you want to in here. They asked him, why do you tell stories? What tone of voice do you think they used with that? I read that as a little exasperated. I could be wrong, but to me it sounds like, why do you tell stories? Just tell us. I could be wrong. So however you hear it in your head is just as correct as how I hear it in my head. We don't know. But they asked that question, why do you tell stories? Why do you speak in parables? And he answered in this way. I tell stories to create readiness, to nudge people toward an awakening. In their present state, and I love this, they can stare till doomsday and not see it. Listen until they're blue in the face and not get it. And that starts to change the parables a little bit. Because what he's saying is not that I tell parables so that I'm hard to understand. What he's doing is saying, I tell parables so that people lean in and so that people have to try to listen and to see. There's this beautiful new book that I picked up recently by an author named Richard Beck, and it's called Hunting Magic Eels, which I bought mostly because the name was unusual enough that I was like, it's worth it. I want to find out what this is about. But he said it in this way, and I think he's spot on. He said, we think religion is a matter of belief. But he argues that faith is a matter of perception. Faith isn't forcing yourself somehow to believe in unbelievable things. Faith instead is overcoming attentional blindness and deafness. It's not about believing impossible things. It's about learning to see and learning to hear. And he goes on to argue, and I would agree with this too, that faith is about enchantment, or rather re-enchantment. The intentional recovery of a holy capacity to see and hear and experience God in the world. And I love that. I absolutely love that. Because we often act like God isn't in the world. And if we act like that, what are we doing here? Right? Is it just routine? It like makes us feel a little better? That's not a living, breathing faith. And so Richard Beck argues that faith isn't believing stuff that our minds tell us is impossible. That's not really faith. Faith is about learning to recognize and to see again and to hear that God really is present in the world and at work. And a helpful illustration of this is Moses. After his flight from Egypt, Moses is tending sheep in the desert, and he catches sight of a bush that appears to be burning up, right? You know that story? And he says, I must turn aside and see this strange sight. And there's a hint in that. Maybe we live in a world where things like burning bushes happen all the time. Not literally. I mean, there's bushes out there, they're not on fire. Thank goodness. But maybe something holy is happening here, in the person sitting next to you, in your own heart. And we just need to learn to recognize it. And here's a question, and I find this a challenging question. Do we give each other the same attention that we might give to Jesus if he were here in front of us? Or do we look at each other with the same attention that we might look the same way we might look at a burning bush if it was right in front of us? Do we do that? My guess is no. My guess is we look at each other and be like, oh, there's Jack. Yeah, there's another Jack. 2 Jacks. And there's Maggie. Seen her before. Do we look at each other as if Christ himself is right in front of us. Are we enchanted by what we see? And we do have this capacity. Each of us can be enchanted. I bet each of us can think of a time or a place where we simply felt joy and awe over something. And normally, it's something like a sunset or a field of flowers or a mountain that has alpenglow on it or something like that. And just for a minute, we're just like, holy moly, that is amazing. Has anyone never had a moment where we just look out and just see something that's beautiful and amazing? I bet we all have. So we all have the capacity to be enchanted. But do we allow that capacity to be alive when we look at each other? There's an author named Lillian Daniel who said this, and it's kind of offensive, but I kind of like it. She said, "Any idiot can find God alone in the sunset. It takes a certain maturity to find God sitting next to you who not only voted for the wrong political party, but also has a baby who is crying while you're trying to hear the sermon." And I think there's some truth to that. I think that's part of why we're here. I think church is a sanctuary. It's a place where we heal, but I think it's a place where we learn. It's a place where we come so that we can relearn how to be enchanted, how to look at the person who drives us nuts and just be like, man, what an incredible work of God. And not say it in a mean way, because you could say that in a mean way. Where I'm from, when somebody annoys the crud out of you, you say, there's Joanna, bless her heart. And that's a way of saying, I'm in church, so I can't really say what I really think about that person. And that's not what I'm talking here. I'm talking about having the ability to look at somebody, and I bet there's people in here today who annoy each other, who just do. And they might even be best friends. That's the funny part about being human. And to be able to look at them and say, man, that's amazing. Because even if we don't like them, even if they believe in things different than us, they are a creation and a child of God. And how wonderful and beautiful. And that in somewhere in there is a reflection of God, a reflection of Christ that we need to see. And hope that they are seeing that in us as well. I think a lot about the future of the church. I think a lot about the future of the big capital C church, but also the small church. I think a lot about the future of this church and of our friends, our sibling church over at First UMC Bellevue. I think a lot about the churches that I've pastored in my past. And I look back and I cringe sometimes, in all honesty, about how I entered those communities. I admit fully before you and God and the whole world that sometimes I entered in with an attitude of, well, everything's going to be fine now that I'm here. And then I would think, how can I fix this place? That kind of thinking, that kind of mindset. And as I did that, as I entered into that space and into those relationships thinking, how can I fix this? I entered looking for problems rather than looking to be enchanted. I entered talking rather than listening. I entered looking, but not seeing. And I've come to believe that this might be, in part, why a lot of churches are in decline. That we have somehow come to think that church is about teaching right belief, or teaching folks even how to be a good person. or how to vote correctly. Rather than church being about all of us learning to see again, learning to really listen again, and learning and discovering together how to be re-enchanted. I admit that I don't know what a church would look like if we approached it in this way. But I do suspect there would be a lot more joy, right? And a lot more peace, and a lot more hope. Think about that. What if you entered into this space or another church and people looked at you and were just like, man, aren't you beautiful? God has done an amazing thing in you. And God is doing an amazing thing in you. And we are so blessed that you are here, whether it's for a day or for a lifetime. And what if that was how we all looked at each other? And together we said, what's God doing in your life? Because God is surely at work in your heart. What is God doing in our shared life? What are we being called to? What are we being asked to learn? Not just for ourselves, but for the world, for our community. What if we allow ourselves to reconnect and be re-enchanted with God's strange and startling and wonderful creation? Jesus' parable today is about seeds and soil, right? Going all the way back. Some of the soil is deep and fertile. Some of it is weed-ridden, and some of it's just dry and dusty. The ground that is dry or weedy, the seed can't take root or is smothered, right? The good soil, it produces a harvest beyond the farmer's wildest dreams. And so what makes for good soil? Is it doing the impossible by convincing ourselves to believe in impossible things? Or does Jesus give us a clue about what is good soil just after the disciples asked him why he tells story when he says, you have God-blessed eyes, eyes that can see, and God-blessed ears, ears that can hear. I believe that there is a grace-filled dancing gorilla in our midst, just waiting for us to see and hear. In God's grace, may it be so. And amen.